issue in this country is that we have given them no identity, we have given them no sense of understanding who they are as a people. And as there's no doubt in my mind that we are very near the tipping point. It's going to change. There's going to be a fundamental change. But as that change occurs, we are going to have to understand that their tie to the land is not something idle. Their tie to the land is very different. Their understanding of the land is very different. Most of us grew up believing that we're above, I mean, it's our culture, we are above nature. This is why we're able to do so much to nature. We are above nature. We may be estranged from nature, but we are above nature. And and indigenous people around the world they are part of nature. And that's, when you start to think about it, it's a fundamental change. So I didn't get into why we must deal with it, but it's a reason that I feel so strongly about it, and I don't know, Harry, if you do. I just think that we have to deal with these issues, but we can't ignore who the First Nations, the Métis Nation, or Inuit are. We have to understand who they are, what they stand for, what they think. If we're not prepared to do that, then we'll solve their problems, or they'll solve their problems eventually, but it won't go. Can I just say one other thing? Because this thing started, I'll change the subject on it a little bit. I also don't believe, I thought we were going to talk a little bit about foreign policy, given but I'm delighted not to, because you'll give me another bloody briefing. But so let me just tell you a story in terms of, don't think that we're the only people who wonder what we're doing here. The finance ministers are governors of the World Bank, and I had to go to Africa when I was finance minister, and I got a call from Jim Wilkinson, who at that point was the governor, of the World Bank. And he called me and he said, there's a country, I'm not going to identify the country, but there's a country in Central Africa, and we provided them with money for some community building, and I would like it if you could go to this. I think you're going to be near where this community is, and there's a lot of wonder as to whether the money's going into the community. Would you just go out and have a look? So I did, fine. Got there a day earlier by some accident, and I was picked up by an NGO to take me out there. I was told it was a half an hour away. It was really 5 hours away. But anyway, I went out to see it. It was very clear that not a penny had been spent in this village. Not a penny. So I came back, and the next morning I was to meet with the president and his cabinet. And I walk in, the president's expecting, and he asked the first question the president asked me, well, Mr. Martin, you've seen the village. Are you going to recommend to the World Bank that they give us the money for the community? And I said, I sure am not, Mr. President. I said, I've never seen such misery. I've never seen such poor people. I didn't see a penny spent anywhere. But the fact is that those people are living sheer hell. And if this is what your community program is all about, there's no way. I've never seen a community as miserable as this one. A little bit of stunned shock around the table, as you can imagine. And a young man leaned over and whispered in his ear. And the president, after the young man had finished, the president looked at me and he said, Mr. Martin, this is my executive assistant. He has something to say to you. And he said, Mr. Martin, you said you've never seen such misery in this particular village. I studied in Canada. I went to university, and I spent 2 summers working up north in First Nations villages. And Mr. Martin, I don't know if you've read, I can identify this one. It's Grassy Narrows in Northern Ontario, which is mercury poisoning. He said, I was in one of your communities, and Mr. Martin, I have never seen such misery as I saw in that village, and there isn't a village in my country where the people are as poor as they are in this one. And I knew the village, and he was right, and I couldn't say a thing. So I think that we've got a long way to go. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that the rest of the world doesn't know it.
Thank you. I hope that in a couple of minutes, we can draw at least Harry and Philip or Michelle Cook into this discussion. It would be interesting. Let me just ask you a couple more questions before we throw it open. One.
When do I get to ask you one? How about right now?
It's an excellent idea.
I think so. Let me tell you something. When after we had eliminated the deficit, I ended up spending probably 50% of my time on international financial things, and so I was essentially the Minister of Foreign Financial Affairs type thing. That's how. So. And I would talk to David Anderson, and David Anderson, as Minister of the Environment, would spend enormous amounts of his time abroad. And if you talk, virtually what's happening in Ottawa is every single minister has a foreign involvement, and they spend a lot of time on that. What does that do to the Department of Foreign Affairs?
Okay. Now, if I was still in the Department of Foreign Affairs, I think Barry and I would reply to you, because I always would go to him for advice, first of all. We would say, if I believe Barry, if the Department of Finance hadn't cut our budget by 18%, you know, we'd have enough people to go out there to actually do the job, but it's your cuts of 18% that killed us. No, seriously. Actually, there's an element of seriousness.
If we ever get back in office, you're not going to get a penny, I can tell you.
It's true with respect to the Minister of Finance. I think, start with prime ministers. Prime ministers, it seems to me, as they get into their term in office, tend to increasingly take on international issues. There are those who would argue this is to escape some of the domestic issues. They're also, I think, in many respects, kind of interesting, and they're a break from the reality of dealing with Ottawa and politics across this country. But so I think with the case of prime ministers, it's gradually increased. It's going to relate to the next question I wanted to ask you about, which is, and I'm not going there now, but which is leaders and leaders' role in summits, because this is really new territory in my view. But I think what is happening with respect to ministers generally, but certainly more so with the Minister of Finance than anybody else, is indeed those other ministers are taking on a greater and greater international role. I mean, I certainly remember, if you take the area of agriculture, the Department of Agriculture is a big player on international issues. And if the Department of Agriculture finds there's some phytosanitary reason why cherries can't be imported from California or wherever they're coming from, and the U.S. government goes crazy, you know, we've got a foreign policy problem. So generally, international issues spread across the government. But with respect to finance, I think that's a whole other category. I think on the whole, heads of government don't particularly like or fully understand all the international financial issues. I mean, finance ministers really need to put in time to understand this, unless they happen to have come with that background. So I guess what I found in my experience, don't trace back the history too much here, but the prime minister that I was serving was very happy to have the finance, most of the time anyway, to have the finance ministers doing the heavy lifting on these issues. And the heads of government were very happy going off talking about other kinds of global issues, and that tended to happen in the period when I was in the summit. So I think the reality is, yes, I think that the finance ministers particularly are absolutely key. What you said about the amount of travel that you did, I think David Flaherty, who you talked to sitting back there, would say that, you know, his brother Jim, you know, was traveling all the time, never stopped. So I think I think if anything, it got worse rather than it got better. I don't know what the answer is, but I guess that would be part of my answer. But let's talk for a moment about leaders and the particular role that leaders have. I guess it really struck me when I went to my first summit, and I was sitting there in a small room. There were 8 or 9 people, depending on who was there as had the presidency of the European Union, sitting around a table, and there was one person behind each leader, and the leader would go that, and we got the picture down on one knee, and we were taking notes and sending them in and out. But what I observed, which I had never really fully taken on board, is the extent to which, if there are 7 or 8 sitting around the table, They call each other by their first name, maybe not in the case of the Japanese. That was always a bit more complicated. I don't know what it was like amongst finance ministers. But they develop a relationship amongst each other. And in the days of the G7, G8, their spouses were along, and there was a social dimension to that, which I thought was enormously productive and made a big difference in one's capacity to deal with issues. I mean, I can certainly remember standing with Prime Minister Chrétien talking to President Clinton. Prime Minister Chrétien wanted to talk about Pacific salmon and why the U.S. was intercepting so many salmon before they got back to the west coast of British Columbia. And Bill Clinton immediately switched. He said, yeah, and I want to talk to you about Haiti. And I hear you're planning to pull your forces out of Haiti. And that would be a real problem for us. Well, this is a kind of dialogue and trade-off that occurs, that can't occur at the level of officials. And they each got that message. The conversation probably took 3 minutes, and it was done. But if you look at the G20, and we can come back to the G20, you see these pictures with 500 people in the room, 30, 40 around, or 50 maybe even around the table. And what I worry about is that relationship starts to fray. So I guess maybe you could just reflect on this a little bit, both as a head of government in the summits, but also as Minister of Finance, where it seems to me something similar occurred amongst your finance minister colleagues. I mean, if I think back to the relationship you had with Bob Rubin and Larry Summers and others, I mean, there was something to that relationship that goes beyond, I think, a lot of people's understanding of what really happens at these meetings, which they see as, giant photo ops and that sort of thing.
There is a view that because the G20 has 19 countries involved, as opposed to the G8, that it's very hard to form the kinds of relationships that you just talked about. I actually don't buy that. It is. I think the problem with G8 and G20 is that there is so much foo-foo around the meeting. The host country is bound to get headlines, wants to get success. The host country basically spends 3 months before the thing building its people up as that they're going to deal with great issues and whether they are or not. Massive amounts of press and everything else, and too many people invited into the room. And we have talked about this. I mean, 50 people in a room is absolutely nonsensical. If you could have 19 leaders in a room, maybe the Sherpas, but that's about it. The problem is that they invite every single possible person from a delegation, and the delegations are absolutely staggering. The G20 in Canada, Saudi Arabia brought 400 people to the thing. The Americans and the Japanese bring them in the thousands. I mean, it is absolutely staggering. But I will tell you that these meetings do take our life on our own. When I was a finance minister was when they went to the G8 and admitted Russia. And the finance minister sat around the table and said, we're not going to admit Russia to the G7 finance ministers. It's an incompatible economy and it isn't going to work, and we wouldn't invite them. And so my own view is, as long as the size is reasonable, which means limit it to the leaders. It doesn't make any difference if it's 7 or if it's larger. And I can give you I'll give you 2 examples of what I mean. When the leaders come together for APEC meetings, which is Asia-Pacific meetings, which is a lot of countries, right? There is nowhere near the same amount of press, nowhere near the same amount of tension, nowhere near the same amount of formality. The discussions are far better, because in fact, you can do the kind of spontaneous things that you talked about. Overwhelmingly, the best summit meeting I ever went to was the G8 in London. The last one, I guess it was in London with Tony Blair. And some of you may remember, but what happened was, the morning of the G8 meeting, there was a bombing in London. And as a result of which, Tony Blair had to leave the meeting. And what it meant was, first of all, it was the G8 plus 5. So you're right automatically you were up to 13 people. And among those people was the Prime Minister of India and the Prime Minister and the President of China. So the meeting, it has got its long agenda. Everything is scripted and everything else, and everybody knows exactly when they're going to pick their ear and all this. And all of a sudden, the meeting is thrown totally off kilter. Blair is gone. Jack Straw, I think it was, chaired the meeting for the Brits, and we weren't going to be able to discuss anything that was on the agenda. And that was when, and some of you may know, that there's a huge agricultural problem in the WTO between India and the United States. And what happened was, spontaneously at the table, the leaders started to talk trade. I can't remember exactly how the conversation rose, but it happened to be something between, somebody basically said to the Indians, I think, where I was saying, why don't you do something right or something? And George Bush was there, and then we started pushing Bush. And I'll tell you, we had about a 4-hour discussion, putting in time for Blair to come back. That I've never been at a summit that was as good and as successful. And I will tell you something. If it hadn't been a meeting to which the Chinese and the Indians were simply invited, so there was no follow-up of any kind. If it had been a meeting, if it had been a G20 meeting, which didn't exist at the leaders level at that time, if it had been a G20 meeting where there was an opportunity then to turn to the Sherpas would follow up. See, the really important thing is you don't need the Sherpas, and you don't need the public service to brief you for the meeting, your full brief. What you need is for the public service to carry through after the meeting. That's where the crucial part happens. And I can tell you right now, as we all know, the WTO is not defunct, but it certainly isn't alive and kicking right now. My own belief is that if that meeting had public servants to follow up on the meeting afterwards, and if given the will that was around that table, we would have a very different trade atmosphere in this country. But we didn't. But it was an overwhelming meeting because it was all spontaneous.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I understand to be, I haven't been at a G20 leaders meeting, but the big difference with the G20 now is spontaneous is the last word you would use to describe it. And it seems to me that's
because you've got a room full of people.
Exactly. Exactly. Let me just ask one more question.
Gordon, I think you've got a problem.
I got a problem? Who's my problem? Oh, stick it somewhere else. No, I didn't mean it quite that way. Not being an accomplished public speaker.
No. Once again, the minister comes to the rescue.
Or is it that Jody comes to the rescue? I don't know. Maybe we'll see about that. You were there at the creation of the G20. I mean, it was really your idea in response to the Asian financial crisis. Of course, it started at the finance minister's level. I don't want to take you through all of this. Peter Heap, who I see sitting up in the back row, has written the definitive version of this history, I think, Peter. But the G20 then you were looking, just before you became Prime Minister, at the idea of having some sort of global steering group. You had this, those are the exact words that you use. Say a few things, if you would, about where you think the G20 is at. I mean, there's a debate out there. It dealt with the crisis, yes, but is it failing its longer-term ambition? What has been its great successes? I mean, we were talking earlier about the Financial Stability Board. And then I guess the underlying question, or the the way I hope you could tie it up is, does it take a crisis to lead to better global governance? I mean, do we have to end up hitting the wall before countries can really deal with the kind of compromises and changes in the power structure of the world that better global governance probably requires?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, it does take a crisis before something is going to happen. But somebody's got to prepare the way for that crisis to occur. The G20 started at the finance minister's level. It started at the finance minister's level because of the simply because the G7 met to basically tell Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, and the other Asian countries who were involved in the crisis what to do. And they told us where to get off. They basically said, the G7 are not going to tell us what to do unless we're at the table. And so some of us suggested that a larger organization be created, and it was created, and that's where it met. It was very interesting, diversion, but the first G20 finance ministers meeting, it was very clear, I chaired it, and it was very clear that everybody was very stilted. People read their little sheets, and nobody did anything because nobody knew how it worked. And what really made it take off was at the next meeting, there were two of the ministers, Trevor Manuel and Larry Summers from South Africa and the United States, who were not shrinking violets. And I essentially said to Trevor Manuel at the meeting, just without any warning, do you really think that the United States subsidization of agriculture is fair? And Trevor Manuel went at Larry Summers and said, it's not fair, this is the worst damn thing you've ever done. Larry Summers would never back off from White and came back at Trevor Manuel. We had a Donnybrook, and at which point all of the other ministers came in. They put aside their notes, they had reasonable translation, and they came into the fight. And that's where it succeeded. Now, what happened then is we made a push after a period of time, and we pick up where Gordon was, to basically create it at the leaders level. If it makes sense to have China and India at the table and not away, it certainly makes sense to do it at the leaders level. The reason that the way was prepared was, to be very honest, the Center for Global Studies played a huge part of that role. I'll tell you, what had to be done was you had to build up among academics, you had to build up among the various national bureaucracies around the world an intellectual construct for what would a leader's G20 be like. And there was a long interim period where the G20 finance ministers, in fact, started to fade in importance. This was before 2008. Life was wonderful. Who needs them to cooperate and everything else? So the G20 finance ministers started to fade, and somebody had to keep this alive. And I want to say that it really was Gordon, it was Barry, and it was the Center for Global Studies. And I'm not saying that because I'm here. It was the Center for Global Studies that had as much to do with the G20 being created at the leaders level as any institution in the world. And I think, I hate to say this, but congratulations to the two of you.
Thank
you. We knew that it was going to go to the leaders level. I pushed very strongly for it. I had every country on side except the United States. Bush wouldn't say yes, wouldn't say no, and it would have happened. But what we all knew is that there was going to be a crisis at some point, and the leaders were going to have to be created. And think about this: if you're got to have a crisis and you have to bring these other countries in, why would you create a new configuration of countries? Well, who's going to take the chance of inviting, for the sake of discussion, who's going to take the chance of not inviting Australia or not inviting Indonesia? Nobody. And so the easiest thing for George Bush, because then he came on side, was to just simply say, I'm going to had this leaders level made on this thing done by the finance ministers. And that's how, in fact, it came into being.
Thank you very much. Let me move now to engaging, unless you've got a question for me, sir.
I will have. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me move. Let me ask first a question, and I forewarned both or the three that I would do so. We were talking earlier today about the terrible things that are happening that we read about all too often in the newspaper, about women being gang raped in India, about honor killings. And Mr. Martin put to me, are we just more aware of these things now, or has something really happened? How could these things have gone on without us knowing? As a matter of fact, the conversation then with respect to residential schools was much the same. Mr. Martin asked me, when did you first become aware of residential schools? And I guess there's kind of an awareness at two levels. First of all, awareness there were such things as residential schools. And then secondly, awareness at a slightly deeper level that kids have been taken away from their families and shipped hundreds of miles south, and they're force-fed a certain type of education. And we talked about that, and when you get to that stage of public awareness, and I guess I said to Susan and Philip, to you and Michelle, I'd be interested in your reaction to this, or Mr. Martin, more importantly, would be interested in your reaction to this question. We can come to the residential schools later, or that can be part of your answer. So, Susan, can you go to a microphone? I had Susan in one. There she is. Never reluctant, but prepared nonetheless.
Whatever it is I want to say.
Yes?
I think a number of things. I think your quote by Charles Taylor about people who are not there